of English 1133. This week we're talking about rhetoric, or how to manipulate people for fun and profit, because it can be fun and it's definitely profitable in many arenas. You're writing discussion posts this week on how word choice affects arguments, both in your own experience and potentially in others. For example, one of your options for the discussion post is to look at how the Democrat Party and Republican Party frame issues differently. Certainly a useful skill as we head into our election in just a few weeks. I'll be glad when it's over, because when I can finally get to the real point of campaigning for the 2024 elections, it never stops. Let me switch over to our lecture notes and get these going. All right, so I'm going to get to these particular terms, these are rhetorical appeals, a little bit later in the lecture. But I thought it'd be helpful to sort of relate them to characters you've probably encountered before. This is, of course, the Harry Potter movies. For logos or reason, we have Hermione Granger. She is all about the books. She does way too much homework and she enjoys it. She's always in the library doing the research, figuring out what is the logical way to get from point A to point B, and generally yelling at Harry and Ron when they ignore her advice. For pathos, emotion, we have Ron Weasley. Ron's not great at thinking, to be perfectly honest. He's usually copying assignments on Hermione or Harry, and he's just kind of all in. He will dive headfirst. He's fiercely loyal. He's driven often by emotion, but he gets the job done. And of course, for ethos or morality, goodness, character, we have our hero, Harry Potter, the boy who lived with the little lightning scar right here. It spells out no, it doesn't really do that. Harry in the books and the movies has certainly elements of both pathos and logos. He has to figure stuff out like Hermione. He has to kind of feel right like Ron, but he is ultimately set up as the character who does the right thing. He's the one who pursues the right goals, and he gets us on his side because, darn it, it's just the right thing to do. Now, of course, all of these characters, these are oversimplifications, but it's a good starting point to think about how arguments go together. That's going to be our topic for today, and I'll go through some examples of that, as well as some vocabulary and frameworks you can use to understand how that works. So we're going to look at a couple different elements of rhetoric, one in terms of persuasive arguments, focusing on text, because obviously that's going to be most important in writing. I want to look at a sample from 1 Kings, a rather interesting passage in terms of arguments, where Elijah is taunting the prophets of Baal. There's many examples of biblical rhetoric. Some of them are a little more nice and positive than this one, but I think it's a useful one anyway. Then I'll walk you through some of the major ways of looking at rhetorical appeals, kind of structuring that from classical models. I'm also going to look at visual rhetoric. We don't really do an assignment focusing on this, but I think it's helpful because the fact is we no longer just make arguments in text. If you have done any sort of design work, you know this firsthand, that when you're trying to appeal to an audience, especially a younger audience, it helps to have some multimedia. When you made the decision to go to SEU, you probably were persuaded, at least in part, by a brochure or a presentation or a video or a website or something. All those use some combination of text and images. So we're going to look at a billboard from the organization PETA, which itself is rhetorically interesting, and see how some of those appeals can work visually and how they combine with text. So those are our main tasks for today. Then we'll get to our week 5 writing workshop to get you finishing up the project of paper 2 and hopefully getting a good jump on the homework as well. The homework is a little bit easier this week than it has been the last couple of weeks because you need a breather heading into our last couple of weeks of class. Start off with some housekeeping. I have finished grading parts 1 and 2 of paper 2, so you can pull up your feedback on MyFire. If you don't see any yet, it's probably because you turned in the paper late. So I'm going to be working through those late papers in the next couple of days, but I wanted to get everyone else feedback as soon as I could. Part 3 is labeled revision of paper 2, and I'm giving you an extension until Monday, September 28th. So that's due Monday instead of Saturday. There's a lot going on in that paper, and most of the drafts are in pretty good shape, but some of them do need a lot of work, especially as you transition into the case study. So give me the extra couple of days to work on that, and that will be a day kind of in between the regular Saturday and Tuesday deadlines. You do also have a homework assignment due on Tuesday the 29th, and that is response to feedback. So that basically is about a page, 250 words, and it's just explaining what sort of feedback did you get from your peers and from me. We did the peer review last week, and how have you used that to improve your paper? So I figured it'd be easier to do that when you've been working on the paper there. If you want to work on that earlier, that's fine too, but I want to give you a couple of days to do the main paper there. So some tips from part 3, and I have left some of this as individual feedback, but just overall, remember that one part of this, and this is true of both parts 2 and 3, you're supposed to integrate the Summary Road of Swales article, making any revisions necessary based on my feedback. You should have this be a full paper, academic paper, which means you need an intro and conclusion. So in your introduction, pay attention to your audience and setting. Both of those have changed between part 2 and part 3. Part 2 is a more standard academic paper, kind of showing how do 2 of your discourse communities match up with Swales' 6 characteristics, criteria. Part 3 is talking to a friend and try to convince her that the discourse community you're writing about is a discourse community, so sort of what you've done for part 2, but also kind of expanding that into the case study. So as you go through that, you're going to need to get a lot more specific. Most of the drafts for paper 2 were just around the 900 word range, which is about what I expected. And that's with your summary and the 2 examples there. Get used to giving more detailed examples for paper 3 though. So don't just say, we communicate through text messages on the website or whatever. Dig into that. Show maybe an example. How does that work? Why is discourse, the communication, important here? It will help a lot, and I'll suggest this in the workshop for today as well, to outline this. So break down the paragraphs, figure out what am I trying to accomplish in each of these, and stick to that, especially if you are writing about a church group, a discourse community within some ministry context. It's really easy to get off track because you want to talk about all the cool things that you're doing and how it's been such a great place and how it just brings glory to God, and all those are good things, but maybe not expanding on those in this paper, okay? Maybe just focus on how this works for this assignment, and that will give you a much better way to meet all the assignment requirements in 900 to 1200 words. As you wrap that paper up, conclude by doing so what, now what. So what shows the significance of what you've done. Why is it interesting? Why is it important to look at these particular communities in terms of discourse? For now what, I'm going to suggest that you say, what do you understand better about those communities because you looked at how they communicate? So what difference does communication make in understanding them on some level? So there you might talk about, maybe, I never really thought about how the genre in which we communicate affects this, or how important really that in-group vocabulary is, that jargon, to establish an expertise or membership, or even why it is useful that we communicate in this particular way, in these particular settings, and not in some other way. Because you know that if you meet in person on a regular basis, you're going to talk to each other differently than if you only meet on Zoom, or if you only write to each other in discussion forums, or if you only use memos in the workplace or something like that. So keep those details in mind. Let's get into rhetoric then. How do you manipulate people effectively? Well, those of you in the SEO Ohio group, we're going to practice this during our session on Wednesday because there's a lot of ways you could potentially use rhetoric for good or bad purposes, ethical or unethical purposes. It's a tool. Let me give you an overview of how this might work. And I'm drawing mainly here on Aristotelian rhetoric. So rhetoric going back to ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. You may remember him from Princess Bride. He defined rhetoric as using all the available means of persuasion to argue successfully. And so when he wrote his book called, wait for it, Rhetoric, he walked through not just how do you use the appeals that we'll talk about in a minute, but how do you design your argument? How do you deliver it? How do you take advantage of characteristics about the setting or the audience or the context that can work to your advantage? And we actually figured this out very young. We know how to make, especially our parents, do what we want. And hopefully, you develop more sophisticated ways of arguing, of using rhetoric as you mature. But it's worth remembering that this is something that sort of comes naturally as we figure out what makes people tick. Particularly, you can break down arguments in what's called rhetorical analysis to what choices did the rhetor, which just means the person making the argument, whether that is in a creative context like a song or a play or a novel, or whether it is an academic context, a paper or a presentation, whatever it is, that person has made a series of choices. How is this argument going to be timed? When did they deliver it? Is it in the context of other claims, other arguments, other messages? What's going on around you? Think, for example, of the sermon series. It's not just, so we're going to talk kind of randomly about a whole bunch of things related to fear or wealth or work. It's ideally matches up in terms of the content. Maybe you're going through a particular book of the Bible. Maybe you want to highlight a theme. Maybe you want to connect it to a particular cultural event or historical event even. At my church, back in January and February, kind of leading into March, we actually just started a sermon series called Holy Sexuality. And I kept waiting for them to say Batman, but they never quite got to the joke. And we did the first 2 or 3 weeks of that. And then lockdown happened. And the pastoral staff got together and they said, I mean, this is a great series, but we really need to figure out how we're going to speak to this crazy event that's now affecting every single one of our congregation members. And so they started changing the themes. We did a series on 1 Peter, talking about how do we deal with exile? How do we deal with kind of isolation and potentially oppression and persecution? How did these people deal with this? We did a series on fear, just wrapping that one up last week. This past Sunday started a series on spiritual warfare. And since, unlike many other points in history, we're all sharing kind of the same crazy set of circumstances and experiences, that makes sense in the rhetorical choices. It's going to make a difference in how we interpret those passages and those ideas and those messages. But that's only one element, the timing. Word choice is something you're going to be focusing on in your discussion posts. Obviously, it's a major part of how you make any argument. How do you describe things? We're going to see in the passage in 1 Kings that one word choice can make a big difference in not only how the original event, the original scene unfolds, but in how we read and interpret it today in English translation. What is the tone or attitude involved? Because you can have a positive attitude or negative attitude and say exactly the same thing, but maybe say it really sarcastic like this, or say, oh, fine. And it's probably not going to go over very well. You can think about organization or structure. How's your argument going together? And so as we think about how arguments work, I want you to think about how can you break it down like this? What choices did the author make in putting this together? We'll look at the appeals in a couple of minutes. The ones we'll be going over today are ethos, logos, pathos, and kairos. And they basically relate to how do you reach particular audiences in particular ways. So if an argument appeals to someone, we still have this usage in English, it's going to be more effective to that person or that group or in that setting or for that reason. If I am trying to appeal to college students, I might emphasize this is going to help with your education. This is going to make you more money in the future. This is going to improve your study skills. It's going to get you a good grade. But if I'm talking to college students and I start saying, well, you see, this is going to actually help with reduce your property taxes or improve your strategies for home maintenance, or, boy, let me tell you about parenting. Most of you are going to say, yeah, not really relevant. And you should. That is going to, in that case, it's going to be a poor rhetorical choice because it's not going to reach that audience particularly well. So you want to think not just about the content of your argument, but its execution. How do you put it in play? So think about both of those. And it's good practice, even just looking at something like an advertisement. Most times when I design my comp-1 syllabus, I put in an exercise to analyze an ad. It's a lot of fun because we're bombarded with these things, and sometimes we don't stop and think, what is actually going on here? But it can be a great way, you can just pull up the Super Bowl ads and say, what techniques did they use here? How does this work? And why is it significant to understanding what's going on in this text or image or movie or whatever it is? So let me give you an example of that. We're going to look at 1 Kings 18, this is 20 to 29. And I'm going to use the ESV, English Standard Version, for a couple of reasons. One, I like it. I think it's superior to a lot of the other options. But also there's a particular word choice I want to highlight a little bit later. So in this passage, Elijah, who is not exactly known for his tact, is having a showdown with the prophets of Baal. And this is a time in Israel's history where things are not going well for the faithful, the followers of Yahweh. The kings and queens are pretty much evil. Ahab is in charge at the moment. And most of the people are following the Canaanite gods, especially Baal in this case. But we have a lot of interesting rhetoric going on here. The main story starts in 20, but I actually want to look at, starting in 17, a little bit earlier than that. So, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Jezebel was Ahab's wife. Nasty, nasty creature. So we've got a showdown here. Let me show you the main narrative. Starting in verse 20, so Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go on limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you, that is the prophets of Baal, call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered, no one paid attention. As you probably remember the rest of the story, Elijah says, all right, that's enough. I will call upon the Lord, and zap. Lots of fire burns up the offering and all the water he poured on it, and the water in the pool around the altar, and it was a very impressive delay. And then Elijah said, let's kill all the opposing prophets. So if you thought that Fox News was trying to own the libs, well, this is going on too. Now we've got some interesting arguments here, and interesting rhetorical techniques, to say the least. We might say that early on, Elijah starts with a relatively straightforward, logical approach. He says, I want a showdown. I want to see who's actually the real God here. And so he says, let's set up a test. We're going to put it in these terms. Each of us will do the same things, and we're going to see which God responds. And you can see even the people say, all right, it is well spoken. We agree to this. But contrast that with how he talks to the prophets of Baal, and how the story is told. So as we go through a passage like this, we could ask several questions to analyze how it works rhetorically. Since this is a narrative, a creative work, I would start with the narrator. Those of you who take my Intro to Lit course next quarter, we can talk about this a lot. So, we don't know the narrator's name here, but we can see that there are certain rhetorical tricks, certain agendas. Look at how is the context set up? What is the setting here? Who are the characters involved? What is the plot? What happens? We can look at what details are emphasized. What's actually told about all these things. What's left out? Who doesn't get to speak? What is de-emphasized? We got ridicule, for instance, going on here quite a bit. We got that introduction passage that I read you where Ahab says, you're a troublemaker. And Elijah's like, oh yeah, you're the real troublemaker. And I'm sure it's more impressive in the original Hebrew. We can certainly talk about tone and attitude here. How does Elijah talk to them? And how do his attitudes compare to the narrator's attitudes? Well, we know that the narrator is sort of on Elijah's side here. That's kind of the point of this particular passage and several others surrounding it, because this is a larger story about Israel screwing up, but ultimately turning back to God, and then screwing up again and kind of repeating the process for all of human history. But boy, you want to talk about a rough kind of outreach technique. Elijah's not a great evangelist in this passage, let me tell you. Look at how he talks to his opponents. Verse 27, and at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. One reason I picked the ESV here is because they make a particular translation choice that I think is rhetorically interesting. This phrase, he is relieving himself, that is, of course, a euphemism. We might say, he's in the bathroom right now. Yes, that is literally what it means. And there is some debate among Old Testament and Hebrew scholars about whether that's a good translation. It shows up in several other versions. Other translations, the NIV, I think, says he is pursuing, here he's away or something. And the argument that the ESV translators and others made is basically that the Hebrew phrase here means something like he is withdrawn to a private place, which is sort of like what we mean when we say, I have to use the restroom, or I've used a little boy's room, and kind of go back a generation there. Does it actually mean this? Well, that's debatable. That's one of the problems of translation. We have all these idioms, including euphemisms, and it's not always clear whether the authors mean this literally or whether this is kind of a cultural reference that we're just not getting. In the same way that we might say, oh, my grandmother passed away several years ago. A speaker of American English and would probably figure out pretty quickly, okay, your grandmother died. But there are other groups, other discourse communities for that matter, who say, past what? Away where? And so it's a tricky translation. But what we do get is that Elijah's got kind of a bad attitude. He is calling them out, and he is mocking their actions and saying, hey, maybe if you guys just scream a little louder, your God will wake up. Now, obviously, we've got a very different belief system here, but the prophets of Baal are assuming that we have to do this, we have to be louder, and you see kind of a reference to the ceremonial cutting. They would take knives and swords and kind of gash themselves and like, wake up! So this is sort of an extreme reaction. And so one way we might look at the rhetorical elements of this passage is by thinking, what is the role and potentially the value of ridicule here? Why is Elijah making fun of this whole thing? And we might contrast that with other approaches. We see, for instance, you probably studied Paul's speech on Mars Hill. He's talking to the Athenians. You have the whole thing about the altar to the unknown God. Very different set of attitudes there. Very different set of rhetorical goals. The last question we might ask about this passage is, why on earth is it here? Okay, arguably this is sort of a turning point because it is, well, honestly, it's a genocide. It's just kind of a cleansing of sorts. There's another euphemism for you, of the influence of Baal and Asherah by murdering 850 people. And this also comes shortly before the end of the drought, the miraculous rain that we get in the rest of chapter 18. So that's perhaps one reason why this is here. We have this dramatic showdown between Elijah and Ahab, and by extension between Yahweh and Baal, and seeing how they fight with each other. So you can take a story like this and think, what is it doing here as an argument? And that is aside from any questions, I think, of whether this is set up as fiction or nonfiction, or does it actually happen this way, or are these historical characters? You can apply these standards to any sort of story, any sort of argument. If you've done training in evangelism in particular, you've probably talked a lot about how do you talk to people about your faith? what terms or attitudes or ideas or metaphors or bridge diagrams, yay, or four spiritual laws or whatever technique you use there are going to work better, and why. How do you do this in an effective way? So I want to dive deeper then into the specific techniques we might use in rhetoric. Given the source for this diagram here, I did not design it, so I take no blame for the cute little smiley face or anything like that up here. But I think it's a good summary of the context and primary appeals in a given argument. So we're going to work through the appeals in a minute, but I want you to remember that we talked already about audience and purpose. So who's listening and why are you making this particular argument? What are your goals in trying to accomplish this? And these are good questions, particularly in the this triangle here. Who is the audience? What are they concerned about? What do they value? What do they believe? How can you appeal to them? How can you move them, make them care about this? Because as we'll see, pathos is a big deal here. It's worth considering then the context in which you argue and the way you set this up, perhaps even more than the basic vertices here of who's talking, who's the speaker, who's listening, who's the audience, and what are you communicating. Let's start with ethos. Those of you in Columbus, you probably recognize this term because there's an ethos church and larger ministry. Some of you actually still may be affiliated with it. I know we've done internships with SCU students in the past there. Ethos in Greek is about credibility or authority. And we have kind of two meanings here. One is the sense of morality, kind of moral integrity. So our word ethics comes from ethos. But it's also in terms of the characteristics of an individual or a group or an organization or a political party or something like that. What does this stand for? You might even hear of the ethos of this society, the American ethos, the ethos of the Republican or Democrat or Libertarian Party. Yes, there are more than two political parties. Just saying. And this is the starting point for evaluating an argument, because for better or worse, people are going to interpret that argument and receive it partly on the basis of who is talking. Sometimes they'll receive a message very well from one individual or one group, and they will fall completely flat with another mouthpiece. One way we see this is in endorsements. So you've seen commercials, I'm sure, particularly for any sort of medical product, where they'll have someone in a lab coat and say, I support this because of A, B, and C. Maybe it's an actual doctor, maybe it's an actor. Toothpaste. It's always the 9 out of 10 dentist, right? I don't know what the 1 out of 10, what's wrong with him. But something about that is going to convince us, not just because, wow, 9 out of 10, that's pretty good, but because it's that particular person with those particular qualifications that give the idea more weight. So you might think about Amazon reviews here. I check the reviews every time I am researching a product or considering a purchase. How close does it get to that 5 stars? And what percentage of we have 5-star and 4-star reviews, what percentage of 1-star and 2-star reviews? I'll read through them and say, is this person a reliable reviewer? Do they have a top 100 reviewer? Or do they give a lot of details about the product? Or is this just, I really liked it? And then sometimes you get the 1-star reviewers, it's like, the shipping was really slow. Like, thanks, that doesn't tell me whether this computer product works. And so we have to figure out, when we're evaluating ethos, how credibility works here. And so sometimes we use this idea of borrowed credibility. You do this anyway. When you cite someone else in your paper, you are using that person's authority to lend credence to your argument. So if you want to say, hey, let me tell you why my youth group is a discourse community, you don't just say, because I said so. Even if you're a mom, you can't just say, because I said so. You say, so according to John Swales, who's like this big smart guy who wrote something in 1987, here are the characteristics of discourse community, and I'm going to show that this youth group meets those characteristics and does so in very interesting ways. And today's paper 3, part 3 of paper 2, technically. So citing a source is one way that you transfer this authority, but it's all over academia. I have this job at SU partly because I have certain professional credentials. I have a PhD in English, but also because, I got the interview initially because my research was on Christian fiction. And as it happens, one of my friends, Bob, is friends with Travis, who at the time was working closely with David Marriott on faculty development and faculty recruitment. So Travis got in touch with Bob, and Travis said, hey, we need an English professor at SCU for this campus that's starting up. And Bob put the word out to his network, which included me, said, do you know anybody who might be interested in this? I was like, right here. And so ethos kind of worked all the way around there. We can also think about logos. Now, those are not the little pictures that are associated with products. Logos in the Greek is about logic and structure. It is a hard-working Greek word, logos. Remember, those of you who've done any Greek study, you probably learned this word already because it shows up in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. Word equals logos here. It's a really important concept in Greek philosophy and in New Testament theology. In the Greek context, in classical rhetoric, this is set up in terms of whether this argument works. So, like this quote from Reading Commons, this is focusing on the facts. Is this a rational argument? And so you can use this to show that not only does your argument make sense, but it kind of holds together. So this is a reasonable claim, your conclusions follow from the premises you have, and the evidence works. We've talked about all these things before. So how do you tell when logos is important? Well, one surefire way is to see that if you are making a claim, that one thing follows from another. So anytime you have an if-then relationship, you have to rely partly on logos. And I say partly because, as we'll see, these work together. Likewise, if you have statistical data, numbers, it helps a lot to make that case in the SEU promotional materials. They use logos when they say, here's how this degree breaks down. You do your classes quickly. We have them online and offline. You pay X amount, which is comparable to education at another university or another university in this region or something like that. You use this in your emails. Say, hey, I've got this ministry event coming up and I have to be out of town for Saturday and Sunday, can I have an extension until Tuesday? Or I've really just been sick with the flu for the past 4 days and I'm afraid I can't get this paper in on time. Can you give me another day? Or even something simpler than that, I'm having a really hard time understanding this. Can we meet and talk about this assignment? It's a natural move because we want our arguments to make sense. And this can be really effective, but sometimes you need another little something to get this to really work. And that's where pathos comes in. Pathos is fun. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. And boy, does it play a role in nearly every argument that you make. Because, again, as children, you figure out that certain appeals work. Now, the typical 3-year-old does not have the brain capacity yet to make a fully logical argument with appropriately cited sources that will hold up in terms of ethos and logos. But they get away with a lot because they're so darn cute. And this is how pathos operates. It makes your reader feel a certain way. It trades on empathy. So in an argument, that means, does the argument relate to your reader? Does it make them feel a certain way? And do you grab them on that emotional level? And again, those of you in ministry context, this is an important discussion to have. How do you balance logical, rational appeals? How do you establish an ethos, make an ethical appeal? How do you balance all that with the pathos? What do you want your audience to feel like from a certain worship set or a certain song or a certain prayer or a certain sermon? Are there emotions you want to promote? Are there emotions you want to avoid? Can you overdo it? Well, yes. And that's where pathos is a little tricky, because you can overdo pathos very easily. Soap operas, my favorite example of this, particularly certain genres of this, like the telenovela. A lot of my students here in California speak both English and Spanish. They love telenovelas. And they're so over the top. Like, everyone is at 11 constantly. Another more recently popular genre that does this is the K-drama, Korean dramas. Wow. My wife loves these. I've watched a few of them with her, and I can't really follow the vocabulary, but the actors are so expressive. Like, everything is a crisis, and you can tell from some combination of how their body language works, or, oh, how dare you? And they're throwing things around, and they're screaming at each other. It's like, wow, that woman is not happy. And then my wife will explain, well, she just found out that her parents are not really her parents, and she's an evil twin of a cyborg or something, or whatever the actual plot is of that one. And it works on some level because the audience gets wrapped up in it. Because they think, oh, I never saw that coming. Or, wow, that relationship is so important to me because I identify with the characters. So if you use this well, then it can tip the scales for you. And sometimes, all of U.S. politics, relying on pathos can overcome serious weaknesses, because you no longer have to argue that you should support candidate X and candidate Y because this proposal makes sense, or you're going to save this much money, or we're going to address this injustice. All you have to do is say, the other side is bad. They want to do very bad things because they're very bad people. We're not even sure they're people. We think they're probably lizards. And that's the whole argument. And that's a problem. But it's a bigger problem we have room to get into right now. So, as you're thinking about analyzing and using pathos, think not just that emotion is present, but what emotions are in play here. How is this going to affect the reader and his or her response to that argument? Because those are important questions to ask in any analysis. The last kind of appeal I wanted to touch on is kairos. You saw context in that earlier diagram. Kairos actually translates as balance, as in a scale. So if you think of kind of the old-fashioned scales where you have one sort of cup over here and one sort of cup over here, and you have to put things on each side that'll balance, like the old-fashioned scales. Maybe you still see them at the doctor's office where you have the weight on top. You're gonna have to slide it over until it hits the right number if you don't have a digital scale. And the idea here is that you balance your argument with the context around it. This is about a timely argument. So writing common quotes here tries to capture the words will be immediately applicable, appropriate, and engaging for a particular audience. That's really hard to capture because it keeps changing. I gave you the example earlier of the sermon series. Yes, there's a logical choice in the sense that it holds together a series of messages, but it also has to relate to the people and the culture around them. So Kairos is dynamic. It changes sometimes constantly, and it is why you have to revise things. You are practicing this in part 3 of paper 2 because you have a new audience. And so you have to revise your argument for that audience. What's going to be an appropriate tone? What's going to be appropriate examples? What's going to be an appropriate way of organizing that argument in a way that might not work for a previous assignment? In the past 15 years, I've taught Composition 1 many, many times, but it's always different. I always have different examples. I always have slightly different assignments. And so to figure out what's the best way to reach this audience in this setting for this assignment. When I started teaching at Ohio State, at the beginning of my career, I discovered very quickly that students at Ohio State, for some reason, really like football. I had gone to the University of Illinois. They had a football team. We weren't good. We just weren't. We were a basketball school, great basketball team. But my students at Ohio State and many of my colleagues cared deeply about football. So I learned that was part of the Kairos. That was part of the context that I had to use in my arguments. And so I would do things like make sure I knew what happened over the weekend in our football game. Because if I taught on Monday morning and we had lost the game, my students would be kind of depressed, very tired, and a little drunk. If we had won the game, they'd be very happy, still very tired because they stayed up too late, and probably more drunk. I'm going to be perfectly honest. Knowing that helped me connect to them better. It was a timely argument. So to use Kairos well, you need to know a lot about setting and timing. The audience will be part of that, but it's more about kind of what's going on around the audience. What do they care about? Here's the key question. What argument can you make here and now that you can't make any other time? When I taught science writing last year, I talked a fair amount about COVID-19. Hopefully, we won't be talking about that in 5 years, except perhaps as an important historical moment. But I'm spring eternal that we won't actually be locked down or having to do all our classes by Zoom or all this stuff in 5 years. We'll see how it goes. That element of the Kairos would change. But other things may still be the same. Maybe we're still going to be concerned about hygiene. Maybe we're still going to be doing social distancing. I don't know. Maybe everyone will be required to wear a mask, not just in person, but over Zoom, because we might actually accidentally sneeze on our cameras and they'll transmit the germ somehow. Technology is on stranger things. So you can use these appeals to look at how arguments work. And these apply to a lot of different rhetorical contexts, both regardless of the genre you're using or sort of the method you're using. And so to follow up on that, I want to look a little bit about analyzing images, and I'll give you a sample of how that might work. First thing to think about is that images consist of a lot of details, nearly all of which are deliberate. You creative types, you know how this works. When you're putting together a visual representation of whatever it is, just like when you're putting together a song, every element matters. You have to decide, how is this going to go together? How am I going to lay out this image? What colors am I going to use? What words do I want to put on there? How do I want to make an argument here? How do I want to represent characters? I encourage you, as you're analyzing images, start with those details. Gather them first, interpret them later. So listing is really helpful here. List every single detail you can see. Maybe you don't know exactly what it means yet. Maybe it's very obvious what it means. If there are words anywhere on the page, or if you think there's kind of a reference to something, plug it into Google, because there may be a quote or a reference or an allusion going on there. Even if you can't quite put your finger on the exact reference, it helps to know that it's there. See also just about any episode of anything that Matt Groening has ever done. The Simpsons, Futurama, a lot of stuff in Family Guy, so like Bob's Burgers, American Dad, Cleveland Show. Not that I would watch any of those. No, those are very bad shows that no nice Christian boy would ever watch. But the references are there. Keep in mind also that images can mean multiple things. Maybe a detail is pointing towards a historical event, but also maybe to a cultural association. If I say red state in the US, you get a sense this is generally a conservative or at least Republican-leaning area, but it might also indicate something about the culture, not just the political leanings. Likewise, something could be a blue state or a red county in a blue state or a purple state, which is, yeah, never mind. I could make a joke later. We just talked about kairos, so think about the context in which this shows up. When you're analyzing an image, you want to know as much as you can about when it appeared, who would have seen it, and why it might show up there. Because it's easy to overlook the historical context, and that's going to make a difference in how you should interpret it. Lastly, think about the audience. How do they relate to this image? The camera is going to show you certain things. Where's the focus? What do you see first time you look at the image? What is left out? What is going to be potentially important? Let me show you how this works. Let me show you a billboard the organization PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, put up in Jacksonville, Florida. It was slightly controversial. See, right? Now, there's a lot going on here, even though visually it's kind of a simple image. And we can look at a lot of different details here. If you wanted to do an analysis of this as an ad, I've had students who write entire papers on images like this. And if we were working in class, then we'd probably go through and make lists on the whiteboard or figure out what we could potentially pull out here. Many students talk about the color scheme. They talk about the image of the woman on the side here. They talk about the connection of whales and blubber here. They talk a lot about body image. And honestly, controversial images like this tend to be the most rhetorically rich. It may not be the most polite or nice or even appropriate images, but there's a lot going on here. And a group like PETA, well, they love controversy. So here are some details that we might pull out. And I've grouped them into categories that you might use if you were going to write about this for a paper. In terms of kairos or context, you might think, who is PETA in the first place? What are they trying to do here? What are their goals, rhetorical or otherwise, for this ad campaign? Why is eating vegetarian, so remember, lose the blubber, go vegetarian here. Why is this important to them? I mentioned the colors. We've got red and white show up in the second line of the text. They show up in the woman's bikini, the polka dots there, and the PETA logo, that visual similarity. your eyes drawn to it. We talked about design. Whales is in a huge font. Yeah, they're that obvious about it. The picture of the woman is right next to it. And it makes visual sense to go left to right. We go save the whales, and then we finish reading whales, and look, right there, there's the start of the woman's body. She's overweight in this image. She's facing away from the camera. In fact, the image is cropped. We don't actually see all of her body. And I think given the context, given the message, you should ask, what is it telling us that we can't even see her? That she's too big for the camera? We could also think about, how is this talking about beauty or attractiveness? If the suggestion is that she's a whale, and a very smart student pointed out that, get back to the image for a second, her arm here may be designed to look like a whale's tail. I don't know if that's deliberate, but it's a really smart catch. So we've got all these design elements that encourage us to interpret the image a certain way. And that leads us to particular themes to write about. So we've got rhetorical links between the woman, the words whale and blubber. This is language describing animals, which PETA is very interested in. How might this work? The ad says that going vegetarian is going to help their readers lose the blubber, weight loss, appearance, attractiveness, all kind of tied up here together. Because what we see of the woman is not really an appealing image. And we could get into details on that, on what is shown, what is not shown. This also pulls in references. Environmentalism, for years, has had one of its goals of saving the whales, to the extent that they based a terrible, terrible Star Trek movie on that whole premise. But they sort of appropriate this, and they say, you know, maybe it's not so much about saving the whales, it's about not looking like a whale because they're so fat and ugly. And as I said, it's not a nice image. So the ad establishes a certain logic that if you don't go vegetarian, if you eat meat, then you're going to look like this. And nobody in the ad's logic wants to look like this. So we've got certainly a negative view, a potentially offensive view, sort of like the passage in 1 Kings that I read you earlier. But rhetoric works in both cases. It establishes patterns, it establishes details, it establishes claims and arguments within that context. And it makes viewers, in this case, readers, in the case of the passage, understand the characters a certain way, understand the plot, understand the themes a certain way. And that is the double-edged sword of rhetoric. How do you use words wisely? Well, you keep in mind, what do they mean? What do they imply? And what effects do you want them to have? It's tricky in the best of times. But you'll be writing about that for your discussion posts, and hope keeping it in mind as you analyze the messages around you. For our workshop, SEO Ohio will be doing an exercise to practice using ethos, logos, and pathos. After that, I would encourage you to start by looking at feedback. That is one of your assignments, actually, for week 5, is to write how you've used feedback. I mentioned that earlier. So go back over my feedback and your peers' feedback on parts 1 and 2, paper 2. Some of you have not read part 1 feedback yet. You need to rectify that. I want you to make a list of any problems that were identified there or suggestions, especially the intro and conclusion, because that's most likely to show up in part 3. And you can start the revision process there. The other thing I want you to focus on today is figuring out what you're going to write about for part 3. You can use one of the 2 discourse communities. In fact, I would encourage you to do that, what you wrote about in part 2. And pick the case study. It should be something that you can write a lot about, something that you have specific data on how do people communicate in that community. It would help a lot if you have a sample document, maybe an email or a text message that was sent out by your professor or group leader or someone who operates that group. And I want you to work on outlining, because it's really easy to get off track in a paper like this. It's really easy to panic that you have so much to work on. So I want you to think of it this way. 1,200 words is 6 paragraphs, 150 to 200 words. Set up a 6-paragraph outline. You know that you have to do certain things in your intro. You've got material from part 1, defining discourse community. You know that you have 6 characteristics. You can use those in certain ways to do your case study. So what do you want to emphasize in each of your body paragraphs? What do you want to put in your conclusion? Where's your so what, now what? Put in an hour in that, and you'll be in a much better position to get that paper done. Remember, it's going to be due by Monday night instead of Saturday night, but you still want to plan out your sessions to make sure you have time to put everything in there. Take a look at the sample paper. There's good ideas on structure. I will be in office hours. Feel free to ask questions about how that works, or we can communicate by email if you can't make office hours. That's all I have for you for today. Have fun being rhetorical. I don't think you have much of a choice, and I'll see you here next week for the week 6 lecture.